it's another week in the smoke-filled room, and we've got an awesome panel of guests and experts with us this week. So I want to jump right into introductions. First up, we've got Erika Ramsey. She's the Vermilion County Republican chairman, also the auditor, I believe, there in the county,
Yep.
And considered by many to be a rising star in the Republican Party. So Erika, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you for the invite.
We also have Greg Hart. He's a former DuPage County Commissioner. Greg, you also have a number of other titles. I think you're on the Republican Party Finance Committee. I think you're on the Illinois Chamber Board of Directors. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you are all over the place, and we're really glad to have you here with us, Greg.
No, thank you for the invite. I'm a big fan of the show and thrilled to be here.
Awesome. We also have John Giokaris. He's a senior tax counsel at Rock, Fusco, and Connolly. Also, sad to say for the poor guy, a fellow White Sox fan. But really, if you are not connected to John on Facebook, he's one of the most thoughtful people on policy that I know. And so I'm really pumped that John's with us this week. Dude, I'm glad to have you.
Very kind of you. Thank you very much, Collin. And again, congratulations on being a new father. I'm very, very happy for you.
Thanks. I appreciate it. Still getting used to living life with a little terrorist. So we're figuring that out. We also have with us Core Strategies political experts, Chris Jackowiak and Michael Butler. Guys, glad you're here.
Absolutely. Good to be here.
Always good, Collin. Always good.
All right. Well, let's see if it stays good as we get into our agenda. So first topic, we're recording this on Thursday, releasing it on Friday. This week, counties across the state held their conventions for the Republican Party. And in many of those conventions, elected either new chairman or reelected their previous chairman. So let's just open this up as kind of a free-for-all topic. Anybody see any developments in counties for either reelecting chairman or replacing chair people that you want to call out as you identifying as important?
Absolutely. Downstate, there were some that were kind of expected. The chairman, didn't intend to run again, and a new chairman was elected. But there were some counties that kind of had some surprises, like Williamson County, their incumbent chairman was not reelected. Effingham County, same thing. There were some, actions that were taken in some counties to try to do kind of a little bit of a coup, or kind of like, some silly antics and games that were being played, but a lot of those ultimately were unsuccessful. We're kind of waiting to hear, it's kind of like election day, the results kind of like trickle in. So we've heard back from some counties on the results, but there are a lot of counties that we don't really know what happened yet. So I would say next week we'll probably have a kind of a brief update as those results kind of trickle in.
You don't want to talk about Effingham County, Michael?
Yeah, Effingham County was probably one of the most interesting ones in Southern Illinois. Jose Durbin chose not to run for re-election as chairman. And Darren and Jose were both backing the previous, now I guess, vice chairman for that slot. He ran and got beat basically 2-1 for chairman. Then he attempted to run for vice chairman, got beat 2-1 for that. So a whole new slate in Effingham County, and hopefully a step in a more positive and productive direction, because that county was always very hostile towards candidates that they did not support, even going back to 2022 and 2020. I mean, they kicked David Overstreet out of an event one time when he was running in the primary. So just a lot of funny business there, and hopefully last night put an end to some of that.
Well, not a good mark on your record if you kick the guy who ended up as our best Supreme Court justice out of your event. But anyone else see anything that you found interesting this week?
I would say up in the collar counties, it was a similar dynamic to what Michael mentioned. I think the one theme that we saw, Collin, was nearly every collar county chair had some level of opposition. In most cases, especially in the case of DuPage and Lake, the incumbent chairs sustained those challenges. I think Keith Brin ended up getting 60% of the vote up in Lake County. Jim Zay, I think it was even larger margin, about 90-10 in DuPage. But I think the fractures within the party are exposing themselves in terms of the wings that people view themselves, and even strong conservative county chairs like Brennan, Zay, in my opinion, are taking challenges, and I think that's something that's uniquely happening this election cycle.
Well, it calls the question, how are we going to come together to fight the Democrats? The good news is it's only April, but it is April and November's coming fast. And as you said, Zay's been a conservative leader. Keith Bryn, even coming out of Highland Park, which is the bluest area of not just Lake County, maybe even the state. And he's been a conservative leader in Lake County. And for some, that was not good enough, though Lake was more of just the former chairman trying to run a coup and failing. But it still is, you see these fractures and, we're going to have to get over this in the next few minutes here, because the real fight's in November, and that's going to be a big battle.
That's right. And just to add to one county that I think you did see a big change was in Will County. And that's with Tim Ozinga with someone taking his spot. So that obviously will have reverberations throughout the collars, I imagine, but couldn't agree with you more. We need to be focusing on the Democrats versus each other.
Yeah.
Chris,
Will
I know you want
County,
to talk about Will. Go.
Will was kind of the story of the night, wasn't it? People had discussions in the media and elsewhere about, whether or not Ozinga was even going to run for chairman after he had stepped down from his position as state representative. He ended up running, and I think that was never in doubt that he was going to run. The shocking thing was a few things. It seemed like they were pretty confident going into it. I was pretty confident, frankly, that Ozinga was going to survive any challenge, but I was there last night. I wasn't in the room. I'm not a precinct committeeman. I live in Cook County, for better or for worse. And the vibe in the room last night was definitely shifting in a very grassroots direction. A lot of proxy voting last night, which I think benefited Christina Clausen, who's a new chairwoman of the Will County Republican Central Committee. And it turned out not even being particularly close. Christina got over 12,000 votes. Tim got a little over 6. So basically a 2-to-1 margin out Will County last night. A crushing loss for Ozinga, but I think he'll be able to pick himself up very well. He's got the Big Ten coalition. That's always been his top priority. He's going to go full steam ahead into the Big Ten coalition. And Will County's got a new chairwoman. I know Christina very well. She's very active in the grassroots. She was very active for Darren Bailey in 2022's election. She's from Homer Glen. Real quality person. We'll see how things pan out. A lot of people are concerned about the money. Tim Ozinga's biggest advantage was that he has bajillion dollars that he could put into campaigns at any given notice. We'll see how things go, but certainly a very, very big turnaround in Will County last night.
And Chris, I want to talk about Ozinga's future later on in the agenda because we've got a topic where that fits better. But here I just want to ask you about Will County. It went way underreported in the last election that Will County was one of the few places Republicans actually did well. We really have struggled the last few elections in most of these suburban counties, but in Will County, actually, we've done decently well and had some wins and shown some gains. And so, Ozinga deserves a portion of the credit for that for sure. So the question will be, what does this do for Will County in November? You've got a chairperson now who's even more conservative. You're losing a little bit of that money advantage. Does this, maybe it's too early to tell, but my question for you is, what does this do for Will County?
Well, I think we're going to see a shift from kind of Ozinga's very corporate understanding of politics. Ozinga has very, very straight set in his opinion that what matters is door knocking, hand envelope letters, and you better not hire consultants. That was always Ozinga's mentality. We're going to be seeing a more grassroots mentality going into November. I expect a greater influence on, there's always going to be an influence on door knocking. You're going to see that again. I think it's going to be a lot of, Christina was big into rallies when she ran Illinois Patriots. I'm sure we're going to be seeing that. But really now it's just about turnout. I think Will County needs to focus solely on, the Central Committee needs to focus, pretty heavily on turnout. I hope they go that direction, but it's going to be interesting. Without the money there, what was Tim Ozinga using the money effectively? That's a question up for debate. But the fact of the matter was we had the money, and will we be able to have the money come November? I don't know. And Christina's got. Her first thing on her agenda has got to be replenishing the coffers of the Will County Republican Central Committee, because a county of Will County size needs to have some serious cash behind it.
Yeah, interesting. All right. Anyone else have anything they want to cover on this topic? If not, we can move on to the next one. All right, good stuff. All right, let's move on to the first quarter financial disclosures. So for those who aren't nerds like us who follow this super closely, every quarter, the committees have to all file reports which say how much they've raised, how much they've spent, where they raised it from, where they spent it. And so people like us spend hours and hours pouring through those reports. So again, kind of an open topic, but just curious what everybody saw. Just at the higher level, you've continued to see sort of slow progress by Republicans at increasing their fundraising abilities, which is great to see. The challenge is, at a high level, Democrats are just significantly better at fundraising. They have a lot of advantages. That's why they are. I frankly don't think they fundraise very hard. I just think they've got advantages that make it look like they do. So the gap is still pretty large, but I do see some promising signs for Republicans. Curious if there's any specific numbers you guys want to point to.
Well, I would agree with that, Collin. I think you've seen Tony McCombie and John Curran definitely pick up the pace on fundraising. I know from my own interactions with them, they're really taking that seriously, in particular on the House side. But like you said, the difference just in sheer cash on hand is very stark, and it shows that even with one good quarter, we have a lot of work to cover up, and a lot of more growth in terms of our donor sourcing that we need to achieve. I think even though McCombie, I think, ended the quarter with about 1.2 cash on hand, 1.2 million, and Curran was about 1.5. Welch had nearly 17 million, and Harmon had somewhere in the $14 million range, if I'm getting my numbers correctly. So definitely an uphill climb, but it's good to see a lot of effort being put in on the Republican side.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and I think you kind of go down to like just one level lower, like on these individual state rep races. And one of the things that I noticed is that some of our like candidates and incumbents are kind of matching the Democrat candidates for state rep, whether they're, challenging an incumbent or they're running, for reelection. Like Kevin Schmidt raised $20,000 last quarter. LaToya Greenwood raised 22. So that's a good sign that they're kind of matching. Obviously, the Democrats, they're going to be able to pour in, hundreds of thousands of dollars in these key races. But it is a sign that things are moving in a positive direction for us, that we've got a lot of candidates and incumbents that are taking fundraising seriously. So we just need to keep encouraging them. And if you see an opportunity to, throw $100 or $200 their way, definitely take advantage of that.
Well, Michael, what I would argue is that, it's a disadvantage to be matching your Democratic opponent, especially at this stage. Welch was focused almost exclusively on saving incumbents this cycle and taking out Mary Flowers, of course. But he was focused exclusively on saving incumbents, and that's where all the money went. So now that we're post-primary season, now the money's also going to start trickling into people who have actual legitimate challenges. So if a Republican is matching their Democratic opponent dollar for dollar, you would usually say that looks pretty good. But when the discrepancy between what the House caucus has, they have 1.1 million, and Welch is sitting on 14 million, that's huge. So you got to imagine that all that's going to trickle down, and eventually it's going to be a 10-to-1 advantage for the Democrats. So individual candidates, it's great to be matching your Democratic opponent, but you have to get to the point where you're basically, you yourself, with your own money, your own fundraising apparatus, are doubling your Democrat, even tripling sometimes, because you have to basically even out once Welch puts his finger on the scale for various incumbents.
Yeah, I'm just looking down the list of targeted races, and I'm looking at, Michael, you brought up Schmidt. He has steadily been improving his fundraising. We called him out, 2 cycles or two quarters ago, that he needed to up his game, and he has. He needs to up it even further, but there's been progress each quarter, so that's good to see. Schweitzer in 104 does really need to up it. He just got in, so we'll give him that. But Democrats are coming hard for his Democratic opponent, Clem, in the unions. So 104 has got me a little bit nervous. Schweitzer's going to need to up those numbers a bit. But, you see 47, the numbers are pretty similar. Grant didn't raise a lot, but neither did her Democrat opponent. I'm looking at a lot of these districts, and it's like, honestly, the individual districts, these Republicans and Democrats aren't raising a lot. It's really going to come down to the parties and the caucus leaders, because with the exception of a couple of these candidates, neither the Democrats nor the Republicans are raising a significant amount of money. And I guess that's kind of the main story here, which is members themselves don't seem to be raising a lot. And so they're just going to be really relying on the 4 tops to fight these battles for them. And that seems like a trend that's been continuing the last 2, 4, 6 years. Aside from a few members who've been good at fundraising, unfortunately, I just don't see a lot of effort here by individual members to do their part. And they're just relying on, Curran and McCombie to basically come in and save their butts.
Well, and another point that I wanted to make that's kind of like relatively new is, when they passed that ethics package, one of the stipulations was that, candidates for state rep or state senate, whether they're the incumbent or a challenger, cannot hold fundraisers or raise money on days where they're in session or, the day before they're in session. So right now, they've been in session pretty steadily the past couple of months. So that's a factor that you see in these numbers as well. And, as we get into the summer and they're not in session, they're going to have a lot more opportunities to be making those phone calls, asking for checks, holding fundraisers, those kind of things. So I think you'll probably see kind of a little bit of an uptick in the current quarter because of that, because you're not going to have that roadblock.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, again, some good signs, some concerning signs as always with the money battle, but certainly something we're going to be watching here. And Michael, as you said, this next quarter is going to be huge. I mean, it's, a summer, the fundraising does tend to slow down a little bit. So I'm really going to look at Q2 numbers, and a lot of people are going to be looking at Q2 numbers to see which of these candidates are real and, which ones are not. And already some of these candidates are in a little bit of a bind, so hopefully they can pick it up. All right. Anything else on cash here before we get into some of these targeted districts? All right. So when your opposition speaks, it's always a good idea to listen. And in the past week, Personal PAC has decided to make it clear which districts they're going to be targeting, at least initially. So we should be talking about it because obviously this is a big development. Personal PAC is one of the main contributors to Democratic campaigns. They are the activist pro-abortion group in this state. And they will, doesn't matter if you're 99% pro-abortion, if you're not 100% pro-abortion, they'll eviscerate you. And that's what they're going to do in these races. And it's pretty rare that they align with a Republican. They're pretty much exclusively Democrat at this point. And they told us which 4 districts they're going to look at the most. So let's talk about them. So they brought up House District 52, which is Maria Peterson running against Marty McLaughlin. They are targeting House District 76, where Amy Briel is running to replace Yednock in what's now an open seat. Liz Bishop is the Republican candidate. House District 104, a district I brought up before. Jarrett Clem is the Union candidate, the Democrat candidate for that seat. Brandon Schweitzer was appointed to what used to be the Mike Marin seat. And then House District 114. This is Kevin Schmidt. We've talked about it a lot on this podcast, trying to hold that seat against LaToya Greenwood, who he knocked off in the last election. So Personal PAC has told us those are their 4 top races. What do you guys think?
Paul, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry, my apologies. I would just say, in the 2 downstate ones, I live in the 114th district. Kevin Schmidt is my state rep. I don't think that the messaging that Personal PAC, or also known as Pat Brady PAC, is going to be using is going to be very effective in this district. I mean, if you try to do that pro-abortion message in towns like Freeburg and Muscuda, Millstadt, I mean, there's a lot of Catholic Catholics there that used to be Democrats. A lot of them have switched over to the Republican Party. I just don't think that plays very well. And I'm sure Erika can speak more to the former Mike Marin district than I can. But I can't imagine that message resonates very well in counties like Vermilion either. I just don't think that those two they're not going to be effective advocates for the Democrat candidates in those districts, not as much as they think that they're going to be.
Yeah, looks like we lost Erika for a second, so we'll come back to her on 104. Anybody else have thoughts? I mean, 52 is up by me, and that's going to be a big race. Maria Peterson ran a great race for Senate last time and almost nearly shocked everybody and almost took out the sitting Republican minority leader at the time. She's going to be a tough opponent against McLaughlin. He's had some missteps, including some in the last week that are frustrating. And if they come in with a hard message on abortion in that district, it's going to play well. I think you're right, Michael. Some of these districts, even 76, that's a moderate district. Yednock was a moderate. Briel is mostly a moderate. Bishop's mostly a moderate. I mean, that's a working class moderate district. Only one of these 4 really screams suburban to me. So it is kind of interesting that Personal PAC will be targeting these districts. And frankly, I kind of welcome them talking to swing voters because they might help us more than they hurt us. Erika, what are your thoughts on the what was the Marin district 104?
So just talking about that issue specifically, we had a lot of issues last year with in regards to abortion and the clinic that was supposed to be going down here in Vermilion County, and It was interesting going to a conference and having people make a comment about that going on down here. People from Winnebago County were asking me what's going on, and I didn't realize that was being watched so widely.
Yeah.
So it's I don't know. It's going to be interesting.
Huh. Well, I mean, it certainly, Marion was incredibly popular in that district, which is why Democrats really never made a play for it. But they're going to be pushing hard for that district. And, in the numbers that we've put together on our end, as we've been talking about, what are the races to watch, that seat there is, to us, the second most at-risk seat in the state for Republicans. 104 is. So, Schweitzer, there's a lot of people who have a lot of high hopes on him. For him, and he certainly, I don't know, on paper he seems pretty impressive, but he's going to have to run a really, really strong race to hold on to that district.
Oh yeah, he's going to have to be out everywhere. As you said, Mike was very well known. Brandon married into this area, so he's got to meet some new people, but obviously he's a wonderful person, a Marine, so veteran, and so we're happy to have him on board here.
Yeah, I can imagine with Clem's union ties, a lot of money is going to flow into that district. I mean, basically, it's 114 and 104 are going to be $1 million+ races for sure. And again, I think to your point, Michael, I don't know that I mind if Personal PAC wants to take a front seat in those races. I'll more than happily let them talk to, and we'll talk about abortion later on the agenda because I think it'll come up, as an important topic. There are places where that plays really well. And I think against McLaughlin, for instance, the abortion message, could be a killer, but that isn't 114. That isn't 104.
Yeah.
And I was also going to add that this list came out, I think late last week or something like that. And we we're going to talk about it later, but there's a recent development where we have a candidate in the 112th against Katie Stuart. And I would imagine that Personal PAC will add that district to their list. Katie Stuart is a big advocate and proponent for abortion. That's one of her kind of priority issues. It's always been a focus of her campaigns when she runs for re-election. And that's a district where, in certain parts of that district, a pro-abortion, a pro-choice message, I think, would resonate. So it would not shock me at all if they decide to get involved in that one as well.
Yeah, they'll certainly add to this list. Go ahead, Chris.
Well, Michael, this list is the people that they're trying to take out. So this might be, they're trying to take out incumbent Republicans here. Whether or not they're trying to take them out because Pat Brady has beef with them personally from his days being a Republican is uncertain. But
for our newer guests, if you don't know, Chris is on a personal vendetta and has been for like a year against Pat Brady. So
ever since he joined the board of Personal PAC, I have a personal beef with the guy. In any case, what we're going to see out of these Pat Brady backed plays is that we're going to see how deep this abortion messaging goes. Of course, the abortion messaging is going to hit in Barrington. Rich people don't actually deal with real issues, so they get to care about things like abortion. That's what's going to happen in the 52nd district. But everywhere else, we're talking Schmidt, we're talking the Marin district, we're talking 76 outside of DeKalb. It might play a little bit in DeKalb. We're dealing with real working class people. So we're going to finally have the answer to the question of what do voters care about more? Do they care more about abortion, or do they care about everything else going on in their daily lives? If the abortion messaging is what takes out 3 incumbent House Republican, well, not one's not an incumbent, but if it takes out 2 Republican seats and a 76, then we know that people just care about abortion more than they care about everything else.
Well, I think it's interesting to see 2 things. I want to talk about which districts are not in this list. But first, Chris, to your point, this is a list of pickup opportunities or open seats, right? Because 76 is an open seat. So this isn't a list of defenses. So let's talk about that. I mean, I'd imagine they're going to play in 45, which I know, Greg, is in your area. And I know that the Republican candidate there, Dennis Reboletti, has already started to get out ahead of that abortion issue. So, I'm sure Personal PAC's going to come into 45. I'm sure they're going to play in 51, where Tasiu for DK is trying to take out Nabila Saeed, who had yet another crazy fundraising quarter in Q1. So there's certainly some hold situations, and now Katie Stuart, I'm sure, where Personal PAC's going to play. Greg, what do you think about 45? I mean, I'm sure they're going to play there, right?
They absolutely will. And I think even if you're looking across the broader DuPage County area, Amy Grant, who I know is another, what many would consider vulnerable Republican up for election, I could see Personal PAC playing there. One thing that I think is interesting, I know we'll talk about abortion a little bit later in the agenda, Collin, so stop me if I'm getting too far, but it can't be overstated how potent of an issue that is for Democrats and how successful of an issue it is for Democrats in the Chicago suburbs. I view my experiences on this through the lens of my 2022 county board chairman campaign in DuPage. And I won't forget in my general election, looking at our model data and seeing that only 9% of the electorate in a county of 1 million people, 600,000 registered voters, only 9% were persuadable. And of that 9%, 90% were self-identified pro-choice. So even though Personal PAC may take some views that are outside of the mainstream of a swing voter, I can't overemphasize the importance of the labeling and how powerful that is against Republican candidates that carry the pro-life banner. And I think if you look at what Dennis Revelletti is doing, I think that obviously this is an issue that everyone has deeply held personal views on. So I'm not reflecting my views on anyone else's. But I think Dennis is smart in the sense that he has to differentiate himself on that issue in 45, which is where I live, which includes Hinsdale, Elmhurst, Oak Brook, historically a Republican district that has shifted over the last 10 years, mostly due to two reasons, one of which is abortion. So I think it's going to be another issue that the Democrats almost solely focus on, and we can't take it lightly in terms of the impact that it might have.
Yeah, and I think we're going to have a great discussion on that topic in a little bit. Just to close out this topic, the other thing I wanted to point out is which districts are not in this list. So remember, these are the Republican districts that Personal PAC, and listen, they don't do anything without talking to the Democratic Party. So this is hand in hand here. They talked about 114. They talked about 104. On our list, those are 1 and 2 of the the highest risk Republican districts. The number 3 district in our list is what you just mentioned, which is House District 47. Greg, that's Amy Grant. That's not on their list, which frankly I find surprising. Our buddy Patrick Finkson at the Illinois, he thinks that's the number 1 or number 2 district for Democrats to maybe pick up. And Personal PAC didn't mention that district. They also didn't talk about 48. On paper, 48 is at risk for Republicans. Now, in reality, it's probably not, because Jennifer Sanalitro's an excellent candidate who's proven to overperform the numbers. But just the numbers themselves, that's the 4th most at-risk Republican district, and it wasn't in Personal PAC's list. The 5th most at-risk district would be 79. That's Jackie Haas, and that also wasn't in their list. So I find it interesting, the races that weren't in Personal PAC's list, maybe they get added down the line, but to see that Grant, Sanalitro, and Haas were not on their target list, I find that at least a little bit intriguing.
I do as well. And, I think one other thing that our friend Patrick Finkson reported on was the fact that Amy Grant reported only $200 raised this last cycle, right? So maybe Personal PAC's taking that into account when making their decisions on their own financial allocations. I think another reason why our incumbent candidates need to start dialing for dollars to up their fundraising. But I have no doubt that you'll probably see that list expand. And I do also find it interesting that they were left off this time.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about 2 more political or sort of campaign topics. Then we're going to get into our broader political discussions, and I know everyone's going to have thoughts on those. So let's knock these next 2 out fairly quickly here. But you mentioned it, Michael, so let's talk about it. House District 112. So a Republican was slated there, and kudos to you and to our team. We knew about this, like a month ago, but it was private information, so we did not burn our sources. Now it's public. We can talk about it. I know you're really high on the Republican candidate there in 112, Michael. Tell us about this guy.
Yeah, he's got a really strong background. So his name is Keeven. He's from Edwardsville. He spent 27 and a half years with the Illinois State Police, was kind of high up within that organization. Then after he retired from there, he served as the Edwardsville police chief for 8 years. He's been very active in the community, in a professional capacity, but also with organizations like the Shriners and some other kind of like civic organizations. So very strong candidate, comes from a great family. I actually went to college with one of his daughters, very well respected.
Nepotism.
Exactly. So now, strong candidate, and I think it's going to be a strong contrast against Katie Stewart. A lot of people in this region are excited that we have a candidate. This is probably the strongest candidate that we've had in this district in a long time. Previous cycles, there's kind of been some weird dynamics and some primaries, leading into this general election race that made things extremely difficult. And we don't have that circumstance this time. I kind of looked at Katie Stewart's fundraising numbers, didn't really look like she didn't expect to even have an opponent at all. This was kind of, because obviously this was a late development. So she has not been raising money, like she has in the past when she's had an opponent. So I'm sure she's gonna crank it up a couple
she'll
of
ramp it
notches
up. I
here.
mean, she raised a $250,000 last quarter, so just the fact that she only raised $14K or $12K this quarter, she's got $500,000 in the bank. So
Yeah.
I get your point, but let's make sure for our viewers we don't overblow that.
Sure.
Listen, 112. So I got to give the Republicans kudos because when we talked about after filing, we said there were some missed opportunities for Republicans, and we said that 112 was the number 2 missed opportunity for Republicans because Trump doesn't kill us in that district. He actually outperformed other Republicans. He only lost by 6 there. Other Republicans tend to do a little bit worse than that, actually. So this is not a district where Trump kills us. On paper, if you look at those local Republican performances, you look at some other factors, it's barely a Democratic district. And so we called out House Republicans, said they needed a candidate in this district, and they did it. They got a candidate. They got a good one. So kudos to House Republicans on this one. I still say 83 is our number 1 missed opportunity. I hope they're getting a candidate in 83 against Hansen. Matt Hansen is incredibly vulnerable after his DUI, and he was vulnerable even before his DUI, but super vulnerable now. So hopefully they're working on 83, but kudos to them on 112. Anything else on 112, Michael, before we move on?
Well, yeah, that's probably it on 112, but I would say that I have been kind of communicating with some people in Kane County, and it sounds like they're going to have a candidate there against Hansen. So that's kind of developing, and we'll see what happens, but there's hope. So they may get it done in both. Good.
Excellent. All right. Last campaign topic. Chris, I know you want to talk about this. Ozinga's term has been filled in House District 37. Patrick Sheehan is the new state representative. Tell us about it.
So for all you parents out there, when your kid graduates from like high school or college, they finally did it. That's what I feel right now for Patrick Sheehan. I've been with Patrick Sheehan since the beginning of his race for state senate, and it brought a tear to my eye to see him finally be appointed to the Illinois State General Assembly. Pat is one of the greatest people you ever meet. He's a Plainfield police officer, formerly on the Lockport Park District and a Lockport alderman. He ran a phenomenally close race for the Senate District 19 against Michael Hastings, the wife beater in 2022. Alleged wife beater. My apologies. And this is a result. This is an example of you work hard, and even if you come up short, always stay involved because you never know what opportunities might present themselves. So the Illinois General Assembly is much, much better off today because they have Patrick Sheehan down there. He'll be a phenomenal representation of his community, and I look forward to working with him in any regard. But it's a
Chris,
great day.
I like that message. I mean, I think Greg is even a great example of that too. And I bring up a really good friend of my wife and mine, that also had a similar story. It's you run, you do your best, you do the right thing, represent what you believe, represent your party. Sometimes you win, sometimes you don't. But I really have a lot of respect for those people who stick around and continue to really invest in the causes they believe in. Because we see too many times where candidates run, they don't win, and they sort of put their hands up and say, fine, screw it, and they move on with their lives. But it shows how much you actually care if even after losing, you stay involved. There's a guy, we ran his congressional campaign years ago who ran and wanted to really, he was an immigrant family, and wanted to really support the country that had done so much for him. And when the voters didn't elect him, when he didn't get nominated by the Republican Party in the primary, he said, fine. And he went and joined the Army JAG because he said, I don't need your permission to serve my country. And I just thought that was amazing. Like, I love these people who say, I want to serve, and they're in it for more than themselves and their own ambition. So I love that message from you, Chris, and just want to echo it and kind of give some kudos to Greg, who's on the podcast for a similar story.
I appreciate that, Collin. Thank you. And no, I couldn't agree more. A lot of the people that get into this business do so because they truly believe in making their communities better. And I think Patrick Sheehan's a perfect example of that. Chris, everything you said, I couldn't agree with more. From a political standpoint too, I think it's the right choice. Not as only is he the right person for that position, but you mentioned his law enforcement background. I can't think of a more prescient issue that Republicans can point out at the contrast on with the Democratic Party than on public safety and law enforcement. I think Sheehan's going to be in a perfect position to draw that contrast down in Springfield. So even though I don't know him personally, I think he's going to be a effective voice.
And to that point, the House Republicans drafted his press release and put it out, and they emphasized public safety, which I think was a good thing. But we want to learn and grow on these podcasts. So one thing I want to share with our audience is just something that I saw in this release that drives me crazy, because we've talked about it in the last handful of episodes here about what issues matter to voters right now. And we said to Republicans on the economic message, you can't fall back to the copy paste message that Republicans always do, which is, taxes and out-migration and economy and just sort of the same bland message we always run with, especially right now when every poll says it's about cost of living, not taxes. I think by next week we'll be ready to share, but our Empower to Win platform, which is something we make available to subscribers, does regular polling on the issues. And we just did our latest quarterly poll on what issues matter the most to voters in this state. And yet again, taxes were in the bottom third. The voters in the state are not concerned about taxes as a specific issue. Cost of living is number one to them, and it has been nationwide. A recent poll had it where 49% of voters cared about cost of living. That's a gigantic number. And yet here we go in this press release from the House Republicans. They have Sheehan saying, I can't wait to hit the ground running for suburban families by fighting tax hikes, keeping our communities safe, growing our economy, and making a more ethical state government. Those are all fine, solid issues, but tax hikes comes in 8th or 9th on the list of issues. Safety is dropping though it is still helpful and good, it's dropping. Economy is low. It's cost of living is the number one thing. And I don't love that I'm looking at this press release and I'm seeing a miss here on what is the number one issue for voters. And we talk about it and we talk about it and we talk about it. So I know I'm on a little bit of a rant there, but if Republicans don't get this right, if we just go in talking about taxes and the economy in November, we're going to lose. Voters right now in this state, nationwide, but especially this state, are focused on the cost of living. That is their key issue. So we got to get that right. Senate Republicans have been doing really good on their messaging. I'm hopeful House Republicans can get a little bit caught up here because we don't got a lot of time. All right, we'll skip talking over Ozinga's plans. I think we probably could cover that in a future SFR, but we've got some guests who haven't had a chance to really dive into some topics here. So let's get into some broader topics. First thing is, let's talk about turnout, voter turnout. We just got through a Republican primary in the state where voter turnout was a record low in many places. We also see that in the general election, there are projections that turnout's going to be a problem because, let's face it, most voters don't like either of the presidential nominees. So my question to all you guys is, what kind of a factor is turnout going to be in November? Does it help us? Does it hurt us? And what the heck do we do about it? And if you don't mind, John, I want to jump to you first just because we're out of the topics that are about specific districts and we're more into your wheelhouse now. So what are your thoughts?
Sure. Actually, I was going to mention I've been waiting for the final numbers to be certified by the Illinois State Board of Elections, but I have a very sneaking suspicion that primary turnout this year it truly was an historic low. The previous historic low for Illinois, at least in the presidential year, was 21.55%, which was in 76. I'm willing to bet we're probably going to beat that. The historic low just in modern history for Illinois was the 2014 primary turnout was about 18%. I don't know if it was that low, but I think it's going to be close. And just to kind of give you sort of a perspective on that, at least up here in Cook County where I am, the marquee race was obviously the Cook County State's Attorney's race, which came down to the wire after several days and weeks of counting. For what it's worth, I was looking back in 2016, there were about 1.1 million primary votes in the state's attorney's race. And in 2022, it was about, in 2020, the primary turnout was around 900,000. This year for the Cook County State's Attorney's race, we were at 500,000. So that's way lower than where we were in 16 or 2020. So, now, primary turnout isn't necessarily indicative of general election turnout, but I also I really get the impression that it's just, there's a lot of just apathy and exhaustion amongst the electorate in general on both sides. As you mentioned, people are just kind of fed up with both sides at this point. If we're going to start at the top of the ticket, the presidential candidates really don't animate a lot of people, at least a lot of disaffected
They have struggled
voters.
animating themselves, John.
Exactly. So, I know in some areas, Trump's a super rock star and he's going to get everybody out there and we're all going to have a hell of a time. But well, thank you. But in some places like in Northern Illinois, clearly it didn't show up in the primary electorate. And as far as the general electorate, lower turnout may not necessarily be a bad thing because, again, something that kind of surprised me, we had low primary turnout up here. O'Neill Burke ended up eking out the state's attorney Democratic nomination. On top of that, the real estate transfer tax hike proposed by Brandon Johnson was defeated. So, I mean, maybe low turnout isn't necessarily a bad thing.
Fair.
Well,
Just before we get into that, Chris, just Erika, I was curious, we've got a lot of experience up here in the suburbs. You're in more central Illinois. Did you see this trend as well in central Illinois with low turnout?
Like the lowest turnout. I don't know in how many years, but yeah, I'm sure it was records low. We don't locally too, we don't have a lot of opposition. We had one race, primary race between for a recorder position. So that drew a little bit of a crowd, but other than that, that was all we really had going on here locally.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead, Chris.
So I was going to say, when you're dealing with lower turnout, you're dealing with a more, in some cases, you're dealing with a more grassroots audience, because the grassroots are usually the ones who are only going to show up. Alternatively, when you're dealing with lower turnout, you could also see it be a more educated populace, more engaged populace, because those are the people who are actually paying attention enough to say, I know I need to pull a Democratic primary ballot for the state's attorney's race in Cook County, or I need to pull a Republican primary ballot for the judge race in Franklin County. So you're dealing with a more engaged electorate in certain cases when you are dealing with low turnout. I think that's exactly what happened here in the 2024 primary in Cook County, was that the percentage of the electorate that showed up was so engaged, and that was the Burke's advantage.
Yeah, I know both parties. I know both parties are concerned about this. I mean, you've got on the Democratic side. I mean, Pritzker recently sent $250,000 to the Cook County Democratic Party for the sole focus of turning out voters. I know the Illinois Republican Party has their Bank Your Vote initiative, and they just had a massive fundraiser for that. So clearly, both parties are focused on turnout, which seems rightfully so. I mean, if turnout is as low as it seems like it might be, your GOTV efforts are going to be that much more important. And that's something I want to ask you guys about, because usually a presidential election, for most campaigns and organizations, you can actually reduce the amount you spend on turnout because they're already going to show up. But I don't know that that's the case this November. I don't know that any campaign or organization can take turnout for granted. They're going to have a specific focus on turnout this November, because if you assume your voters are just going to show up, I don't know that the numbers bear that out.
Well, I would say in Illinois, it's a particularly acute problem. I don't think there's any debate on this panel or more broadly that, the state is not in play at the presidential level, right? And even in our primary, we had two fairly decided primary elections for president, which is usually the main driver of why, most people come out to the polls. So I think what we're going to have to do, especially as it relates to a lot of these down ballot races, beneath a statewide office holder and below, I think we're going to have to get smart about how we, in our case, Republicans, talk about different mediums of voting. We've seen, at least in the suburbs, a massive shift towards more mail-in votes, more early votes. And I think you mentioned the Bank Your Vote initiative, Collin, which I was thrilled to be a part of, highly successful. But really, a lot of those efforts for the Illinois GOP level is going to be pushed towards encouraging Republicans to participate in the process earlier, right? Banking your vote not only saves candidates money, it's less costly for candidates to reach an electorate if they get their votes in early, especially low propensity Republican votes that are going to be on our side. And the biggest problem is just getting them to the poll. So I think we kind of have to re-engineer how we think about voting, at least on the Republican side, and start to be a little bit more open to different mediums. Otherwise, we're going to keep losing these races by the mail-in margins.
Well, kudos to the RNC and kudos to ILGA for that, because I think when a lot of people saw the Bank Your Vote initiative, they kind of chuckled and said, why are you doing this in a presidential election year when turnout is always going to be at the highest? And then here we go. We're now talking about how turnout might be, really low for a presidential year. So kudos where it's due. I mean, there was some foresight here that went into this, and it's obviously going to be a really important initiative for the fall. Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, I would just say, like was alluded to. I mean, president's not in play. There's no statewide office holders on the ballot this cycle. So I think that really provides an opportunity for us as Republicans to make these races local races. And I think there's a lot we can do with like targeting and things of that nature to get the vote out where it actually matters, right? Like some of these counties, They're all Republican incumbents and they don't have opponents or they don't have serious challengers. But if we can kind of focus on key areas, that could make a huge difference in some of these legislative races and even county races. So we just got to be smart.
And that's the key thing. All Republican county chair people and township organizations and precinct captains can do. Their number one job right now needs to be turnout, because campaigns need to focus on the persuasion. But if the organizations can focus on the turnout, that makes everybody's job so much easier. So all of these races are at the end of the day going to come down to turnout, because right now the Republican Party isn't enthusiastic about their a lot of the Republican Party is enthusiastic, but there's a big chunk of the Republican Party who isn't enthusiastic about Trump. A lot of Democrats, no Democrats are really enthusiastic about Biden. So it's to our advantage to gather as much enthusiasm as possible to continuously, try and pass the Democrats in terms of enthusiasm and turnout. And even if we struggle with that median voter because of abortion or some other issue, just Trump sucks, if we can increase the turnout to the Republicans' advantage, then they actually have a good chance in November.
I just want to take that clip of, I know it'll be out of context, but I don't care. I'm going to take that really quick clip of Chris saying Trump sucks, and I'm going to make it when he's not paying attention, I'm going to make it his ringtone on his phone.
You will never have access to my phone call.
I think we just lost Erika. We knew we were going to lose her. She has to go pick up their kid because her husband couldn't do it. So if Erika isn't able to join us again, I just want to say thank you to her for being with us. She's awesome, and we're glad to have her back in the future. Let's jump to the next topic, which is even more broad discussion, which is really about what does the future look like for the Republican Party. There's two reasons why this topic has come up. So first, as we were talking about building this agenda, Greg highlighted that Larry Hogan is coming out or had come out or something to the city of Chicago. And obviously he's got a brand of politics that's worked pretty well in a blue state. And also one of our viewers last week flagged a New York Times article asking what Republicans do and do they create a sort of a shadow party in exile to get away from MAGA Republicans? And that lit off a huge discussion internally amongst our team. So let's just put it all under a broad sort of discussion about what does the future look like for the Republican Party? As has been mentioned on this podcast earlier today and many, many times, Trump is a boon in some areas. He's also a problem in other areas. And as the party goes overall, he might win in November, but I think on average, he's going to hurt us in more swing districts and he's going to help us. And that's just based on the data, not really opinion. So the question then is, what do we sort of do as a party? What does the future look like post-November? Greg, I want to go to you because I know you had some thoughts based on Hogan. So go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think you touched on it, but in my short answer, it's the future of the party cannot be a one size fits all. The same messaging and the same focus that works in Texas or Florida or Tennessee is not going to work in a blue state like Illinois. And I think when you find examples of that, it's been more difficult since 2016. Clearly, as you said, Collin, Donald Trump may win nationally, but he's not going to win here in Illinois. And on net, it's probably going to hurt a lot of down ballot candidates having him as the representative of the national brand. But if you look at other states that are blue and have more in common with Illinois than the states I mentioned, Massachusetts, Maryland, New England, Vermont, for example, they have had Republican governors, Republican statewide elected officials that have been, in many cases, some of the most popular politicians in the country. Larry Hogan, for example, is running for U.S. Senate, former governor of Maryland, very popular. And he's beating both of his Democratic opponents in recent polls by almost 8 points, looking like a very real pickup opportunity. And what he has done to differentiate himself strategically from the national Republican brand is going to help Republicans hopefully up their numbers in Washington. And I think you don't see, at least at face value, I'm sure he had his detractors in Maryland, but it's not prohibiting him from being successful. And if Illinois wants to have a future, and I believe we will, as a state that can and will elect statewide Republican office holders, whether that be at the governor or U.S. Senate level, we as a party have to be more inclusive of different views. And what works in Illinois will likely be vastly different than what works in Tennessee. I think about willingness to, and we don't have to agree with each other 100% of the time, but we talked about the pro-choice issue here. We haven't had a pro-life Republican governor in my lifetime. So we just are going to have to be realizing that we're stronger if we stick together despite the differences. Even if we agree on 70% of issues, that's better than the alternative. And I think if we can come to that conclusion, we'll have a lot more successful futures in blue states.
Greg, let me tell you something that just drives me crazy about even like specifically that abortion discussion. Ever since I started in politics, I grew up in the Mark Kirk era. I was living in Lake County at the time, and it drove me crazy because I would tell people, even my pro-life friends, you have to support Mark Kirk because in IL-10, that's the only candidate that's going to win there. But I didn't see that was reciprocated. I saw, that sort of that model had to be replicated everywhere, that you had to be a pro-choice Republican or you couldn't win. And I argued in places like Aurora or the South suburbs where pro-life Democrats were doing very well, that actually it wasn't the fiscally conservative, socially moderate sort of Mark Kirk model that was working, but instead it was more of a fiscally moderate, socially conservative model that might work. And so I think the reason that a lot of people struggle with this is it seems like everyone's in camps where it's either everybody has to be pro-choice or everybody has to be pro-life, without this recognition that down in Chris's area or Michael's area, a pro-life candidate is the only candidate that's going to win. Whereas in your area or my area, a pro-choice candidate is probably the only candidate that would have much of a shot. And so it's this big tent, as you said, but I haven't seen a lot of willingness from both sides of that fight to say, okay, yeah, I may be pro-life or I may be pro-choice, but here's my buddy Greg Hart. He thinks differently than me, and we're going to support each other. So you're going to support a pro-life candidate. I'll support a pro-choice candidate. It just doesn't seem like we're able to do that in this state. I don't know what you've seen.
Right. No, I agree with you. And I think there's a lot of reasons why that may be the case. I will say, and this isn't my critiquing anyone in particular, but the national influence on local, whether that be statewide or even down ballot from statewide races nationally, has been particularly pronounced in the last 10 years. We have voices in Congress, for example, that are typecasting many Republicans in Illinois that could win, but even if they could win, they're getting branded with whatever Marjorie Taylor Greene says. And we have to understand that some views may be out of lockstep with where we live, and as long as we work together and focus on the 70% of issues we agree with, we'll be successful. But that has gotten harder and harder. And I will say, when you have someone saying that we don't want so-called rhinos in the party, and that's coming from a national level, a national voice, it makes it increasingly difficult. And I think the sooner we realize that's not helpful to the solution, the better off we'll be.
Yeah, I'll pass it to the rest of you guys. I just know, listen, we talked about it last week. I get a lot of flack for supporting my friends in the Illinois Freedom Caucus or the Eastern Bloc because, listen, their politics represent their region. And I think that's an important part of the party. We can't sit here and say, we have to kumbaya big tent, but let's get rid of the Darren Baileys of the world and the Mary Millers of the world. Their politics works for their region. And so I think it has to be this come together that we are a diverse state. As a matter of fact, a study recently said Illinois is the #1 state for representing this country as a whole. We have that diversity. We have to understand that that's the state we live in. This is not a one-size-fits-all state. It's a giant state that frankly represents the diversity of the country.
And
go ahead, John.
No, I was going to say, not to jump ahead here a little bit, but people have been noticing that Latino voters have been trending more and more Republican in recent years. And, frankly, I've always, it's always perplexed me that they weren't a Republican voting bloc. They're incredibly hardworking. They're very family oriented. They're very religious. You would think that, they would be a very consistent, dependable Republican voting bloc. And to that effect, states like Texas and Florida have done very well in Latino communities. And again, it involves, being present in those communities and building those relationships over time. Doesn't happen overnight, but the more you not only maintain a consistent presence, but bring them in to be, part of the process. Senator Marco Rubio down in Florida, a number of Texas lawmakers as well. That's Anthony Gonzalez. That is how you expand the tent. And again, they're not, they're all solid conservatives too. We may not agree on everything, but I agree with them on, 80 to 90% of everything, which is good enough. That is how you, build and grow the party to adjust to the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Chris, Michael, go ahead. Close us out on this topic.
I would just say I think part of the issue is kind of like a little bit of like a growing pains kind of thing, because people like President Trump have introduced a lot of new people to the Republican Party that weren't typically, voting for Republicans. They weren't involved in the process. We kind of have to figure out a way, kind of like Greg said, to kind of bring everybody into the fold. We have to be united, as Republican office holders, as supporters of Republican candidates. And I think we're getting there, but it's going to take work.
Michael, is there anything you can't put a positive spin on? Like, I feel like if I ever get like a bad doctor's visit where they give me really bad news, you're actually going to be my first call because you find the silver lining in everything.
I appreciate that, Michael. I think that's a good quality.
I try to listen to like a lot of like liberals, like Bill Maher and David Pakman. I don't know if you guys are familiar with him, but he has a podcast. And I saw an interview that he did recently where he said that, typically like Republican elected officials or Republican supporters kind of were in three buckets. You had like fiscal conservatives that cared, their priority was lower taxes or less regulations. Then you have like social conservatives and evangelicals who care about, pro-life and religious freedom and Israel and those kind of things. Then you have your more libertarian-minded people. That was historically kind of where Republicans drew their support from. But Trump kind of added this fourth category where there are people that, they're not really necessarily motivated by policy per se. It's a lot of more, working class, people that kind of support more dynamic candidates like Darren Bailey, for example. And that fourth bucket, I think, is part of the issue why one of the reasons why we're having some of the issues that we are, and we kind of have to figure out how to navigate that. I mean, I personally have been called a rhino before, and I think that I'm the furthest thing from that. But I've been called it. I've also been called a fascist. So, one man's rhino is another man's fascist.
Yeah, Michael, you had me until you said Darren Bailey was a dynamic personality, but otherwise, I loved your point. Chris, going from the silver lining to the storm cloud. Chris, finish us off here.
So Greg mentioned the fact that there's been no pro-life Republican governor in his lifetime, and that's true. But one of the things that the Republican Party had 20, 30 years ago was power. Even if it was limited to one statewide office, even if it was limited to a slim minority, meaning that the Democrats had a slim majority in the General Assembly chambers, they still had power. They had influence. And that was able to keep, very liberal Republicans like your Mark Kirks and your, Jim Edgars in the same party as your Henry Hydes, your Pate Phillip, I think his name was, from DuPage County. That was able to keep them together because they all had one goal in mind, was power. They want to maintain whatever power they have. Republican Party has no power in the state anymore. They're in a super duper minority in Springfield, perhaps the super D duper minority to come. And their influence at county levels is increasingly slim. So the thing the Republican Party needs to do is find a way to achieve some resemblance of power again and use that power to bridge the Republican Party again. I think Rauner actually did a very good job with this when he first got elected. I know.
Say nice things about Rauner?
Mark the date and time. I have something good to say about Bruce Rauner, because Bruce Rauner was able to be both a populist figure rallying against the bad things that were happening in Springfield, while also being a very, very, very basically liberal Republican. And that obviously led to him being one of the worst governors in Illinois history. But at the beginning, but at the beginning, there was some type of party unity around this message. So the Republican Party needs to find some resemblance of power to achieve a bully pulpit, to achieve the spoils of victory in order to keep people in line to have a unified Republican Party. Because when you have nothing to give out, when you have nothing to strive for, there is no way to keep so many different personalities and ideologies in line.
Fair. That's a good point. Let's go into two trends that we've seen that are actually super positive for Republicans. So first, I want to point to is one that frankly surprised a lot of Democrats, but we've seen it, which is a little bit of a trend, not a huge one, but a little bit of a trend towards women in the suburbs specifically that are moving towards Republicans. There was a poll by POS, Public Opinion Strategies, that was run by NBC News that found that the Democrats' advantage among suburban women overall has shrunk from a 10-point margin in 2016 to a 5-point margin in 2023. That's 5 points in movement in the suburbs, specifically amongst women towards Republicans. They also saw in the same poll movement in voters of color, which we'll talk about next. So here we're just going to talk about women. I do want to balance this out, which is that movement Republicans are seeing, Trump is not seeing. So this is a next topic we'll talk about. Trump is seeing a bit of a bump, but here it's just Republicans, it's not Trump. The Republican Party is seeing that we're actually doing a little bit better with women overall, including in the suburbs. Our problem is that Trump is kind of a bit of a drag there. Just last month, where he was like, suburban housewives actually like Donald Trump. Well, I don't think today's women want to be called suburban housewives, I'll be honest. And that's a bit of the problem, is we've got a brand problem, but there's an underlying number here that is really positive for Republicans. And as Democrats lean more and more into abortion, as John said earlier, that doesn't play with every single demographic. And I think there's too many people who still talk about, sort of from the Bill Clinton days, that soccer mom caricature, and that's what a suburban woman looks like. But in our polling and in all of our politics, we're seeing that suburban women are not monolithic anymore. Many suburban women run the finances for the household. They work in business. They're leaders in business. They're leaders in the community. Suburban women are not soccer moms anymore. There may be some, certainly, but their women are not just fitting into one bucket anymore. And as Democrats push a far left progressive agenda to reach that sort of progressive white woman that they're trying to reach, the problem for them is it's hurting them with many other demographics of especially women, Hispanic women, African-American women, groups that are not as socially liberal. And as you see here, last thing I'll say from this is and then I'll open it up for discussion, is back in the 1990s, roughly 2 in 10 suburbanites were people of color. Now that's roughly 5 in 10. It's a huge change in the suburbs, a huge swing in the racial demographics, if you will. And so I've said a lot that as Democrats pursue this really, really strong abortion agenda, it might help them in some districts. A Barrington district, like what McLaughlin has to face in 52, or maybe 45, where they aren't as high in a minority population, and it's wealthy white people who are going to make that decision at the ballot box. Well, then, yeah, abortion is going to play very well for them. Maybe it plays in Lakeview. Maybe it plays in some of these districts that are a little bit more progressive. But in a lot of these working class areas, it doesn't. And the numbers are bearing that out. So that was a lot. I don't like to lay the groundwork that much, but it was a lot of information. What do you guys think about that? Of the movement towards Republicans, not necessarily Trump, but towards Republicans amongst suburban women?
Well, go ahead.
Just real quick. I mean, going back to what you said earlier, Collin, about how cost of living is really the number one issue. I think that's part of it. I mean, some suburban areas, I guess abortion can play, but I would think that at least most well-informed voters know that it's going to be pretty safe in this state. I mean, I think the state is almost branding itself as sort of the abortion capital of the Midwest. So I don't think I mean if you can get any mileage out of that, great, but I think for the vast majority of, and again, it's a woman thing and it's a man thing, and it doesn't. I mean, gender doesn't really matter here. Cost of living is high. When you go out to get groceries, they're still really expensive. When you go out to get gas, it's still really expensive. I posit that that's probably indicative of the bump that we're seeing, at least in some suburban areas, gravitating back towards Republicans, because at the end of the day, you're not dealing with abortion every day. You're dealing with getting groceries and getting gas and all these other things that go into cost of living. Go ahead, Greg.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head. One thing I will say, just as a caveat and a grain of salt, that I take with the numbers is, not all, like we said, not every type of Republican can win in every different. Well, not all suburbs are created the same either. I think the suburbs of Chicago, for example, are much different than the Atlanta suburbs, where I think there's probably at least 5-point swing more to the Democratic side in the Chicago suburbs than there are in the Atlanta suburbs. But that said, I mean, the trends can't be denied. I agree with John. I think this, and one thing I will also add is, I think it speaks less to disagreement with the Democrats' abortion stance. I think in general, suburban women do agree with being pro-choice in general, right? But affordability is more important on their list of priorities today. And like John said, if you're going to fill up your tank, or if you're going to buy milk at the grocery store and it's costing you a lot more than it did last year, despite the benefits of Bidenomics, as the president would say, people aren't feeling it, and that ultimately is going to drive their vote more than some of the other issues, to the extent that, affordability is a big issue to them, which in many cases in the suburbs it is.
Well, Greg, to back you up, I mean, when you talk about comparing Illinois to any other state, that's a fool's errand, right? I mean, we are in every category, Republicans underperform in Illinois. So, we may not see this in this state, but in general, when you say nationwide, suburban women have a 5-point swing towards Republicans. That's a good sign for Republicans nationally. And it tells me in Illinois, if we get our acts together, we can start to take advantage of that swing. So yeah, Illinois is a wasteland for many, many reasons. And this is just one of them. But I think it's a heartening trend to see that there is an opening here. And it really does point to that fact of, yes, abortion is a strong message, but as I've explained a number of times over the last 2 years, abortion isn't the issue for Democrats. They use it as an issue to prove that Republicans are extremists, right? Where Republicans and Democrats use issues so differently. Republicans, we get stuck on the issues. It's all we ever talk about is the issues. Democrats don't talk issues. They use issues as an excuse to paint a broader picture. This is like, you get a bunch of policy people in a room, and then somebody like me who comes in and wants to talk about politics, and they're like, they want to run me out of the room because I'm not talking about specific policies. I remember I came downtown to an event like a decade ago with Eric Kona, I think, who, John, you and I both know him, and there was a group of very policy oriented people, and he made the mistake of putting me on the panel, and I kept throwing out straw man arguments and political arguments, and they never invited me back. But I think that's the point. Republicans are very, what's my white paper solution? What's the issue? The issue is immigration. The issue is this. The issue is that. Democrats use issues to prove the larger narrative. It's marketing, it's advertising for them. And so it's not, abortion in our poll, I'll give a sneak peek. We'll talk about this more next week, but abortion came in 7th in our poll from Illinois voters on most important issues. It isn't the issue itself. It's that Democrats use abortion to make Republicans look like extremists, and that scares voters from wanting to vote for Republicans. And that's what we face in Illinois. But I think the larger focus to this topic and the agenda is that we have space here. We could improve here if we do a better job with our messaging, if we have better messengers to carry that message. When you see a 5-point swing among suburban women towards Republicans nationwide, that looks to me like a huge opportunity if we could actually take advantage.
I'm going to disagree with you, Collin. You said that abortion isn't the issue. It is. Abortion is the only issue Democrats care about. They don't care about anything else. Every other piece of policy that the Democrats push towards is just pushing towards abortion, because that's the only issue Democrats care about. If you go down to Springfield and if a Democrat down in Springfield said, I don't know about this, they're gone. They're gone, because that's the only issue the Democratic Party cares about in a post-Dobbs America.
Chris, I want to ask you about that because I want you to expand on it. So I agree with you. You're talking about the Democratic Party, and all they care about is abortion. And frankly, that was going to be my closing point on this topic, which is I see Democrats leaning into this problem, that they think the solution is just more talking about abortion, leaning into IVF, which that one I agree with. But the idea is, even in this article in The Hill that I read that brought this to my attention, you had several quotes from prominent Democrats who were like, oh, we'll be fine because we'll just talk about abortion even more, and that will bring women back. And I kind of chuckle and say, good, go for it. Because I think as a whole, the more they only focus on abortion, the more that hurts them with voters who are not monolithic anymore. So, Chris, I think you're right. I think the Democratic Party, especially in this state, all they care about is abortion. And this is a moderate working class state where that's not the only message that voters in the state care about. So I'd ask you to expand on that a little bit.
Well, what I'm interested in with this whole shift about suburban women is I want to see this broken down by income demographics, because like Greg said, suburbs are different from one suburb to another. We talk about a suburb like Bridgeview. Bridgeview is a suburb, but Bridgeview is a much, much, much different suburb than Barrington is. So you're talking like basically the opposite of Barrington, if there's could ever be a suburb. And so I think that what you're probably going to see, if you even broke down this polling even more, is that the gains that the Republican Party is making is among lower income suburban women or more working class suburban women than it is amongst upper class suburban women. I believe that upper class suburban women are probably sticking with the Democratic Party because of this abortion messaging. But once you get down to a lower income demographic of people, that's where the opportunities come from with the Republican Party. However, it also requires the Republican Party to do some soul searching and say to myself, are the economic policies that I am presenting actually beneficial to lower income people? And that's a question not a lot of Republicans want to have, unfortunately. But the truth of the matter is yes, there's an opening for the Republican Party, even in spite of the abortion issue with a certain demographic of suburban women, even if the Democratic Party thinks that suburban women are monoliths.
I love that the only suburban community Chris knows outside of the south suburbs is Barrington. It's fun. Sorry, go ahead, John.
No, I mean, my question was going to be, as far as upper class women, do you really think they're sticking with Democrats because of abortion or because of Trump?
It's probably both thing. I mean, but those two issues kind of go hand in hand because Democrats have been painting Trump as an abortion extremist since 2015. Now he's getting out ahead of that a little bit. There's been a little bit of controversy because Trump basically said, I think abortion is an issue that should be left to the states, which really isn't a change from his original opinion, but that's besides the point. But I do think it has a lot to do about abortion for a reason I mentioned earlier. If you are in an higher tax bracket, you don't experience the same issues as a lower tax bracket does when it comes to cost of living. So upper income people are allowed to engage in things like worrying about things like abortion because they don't care. They don't worry about things like, can I put food on the table? Can I afford to send my kid to a good school? Because they already have enough money. So yeah, of course, the abortion messaging is going to stick with a higher income demographic of people. They can afford to care about it.
Well, I think Collin, I agree with what you characterize as just a broader range of issues that come to form a brand of extremism, which is what they're pushing, right? And again, whether we agree with it or not, Democratic Party is trying to group Trump, abortion, now IVF. And by the way, Collin, I saw your op-ed, which I thought was excellent. So very nice work there. I think that's a broader issue that I think Republicans on a whole nationally agree with, but because of the voices of a few, we're being typecast as extreme across the board, right? And I think you can cut it down any which way, any socioeconomic different divisions, but the broader issue of extremism is, I think, what the message is going to be from the Democratic Party, regardless of what race is being discussed.
Well, and let's be honest. I mean, this is where I see an opening. I mean, I'd have left the state a long time ago if I didn't think we could actually win in this dang state. You guys are all still here for a reason. Maybe not for politics, but our exit polling from the last election and the election before that showed a very moderate electorate and showed, by the way, that voters think Democrats and Republicans are just as extreme as each other. It's not just one party over the other. And so there's an opening here because we haven't messaged on this. The Democrats have spent millions and millions of dollars painting Republicans as extreme, and we really haven't done the same to them. And you think about in this state, it's Democrats who want to label parents as child abusers if they don't let their underage daughter get an abortion. And they want to have DCFS come in and take the kids away. I mean, it's Democrats who are pushing down in Springfield these ridiculous bills. They're the extremists in this state. We just don't put that narrative out to voters because we get stuck on, let's talk about taxes and let's talk about immigration. We're talking issues while the Democrats have taken it to the next level because they actually understand messaging. To me, if we engage on this battle, if the voters are just as likely to think Democrats are extreme, and we haven't even touched that battleground yet or that battlefield yet, what would it be if we started to play in that sandbox? I mean, I feel like we could make some huge gains here.
Well, the issue, Collin, is that, and we're going to find out more about this after we do our polling comes out, of course, and that's why you should subscribe, like and subscribe, of course. But when it comes to the abortion messaging, Democrats have a really easy message. Republicans are anti-choice. But to do the messaging that you're talking about, Collin, of Democrats want to take away your children if you don't want your daughter to get an abortion when she's 12 years old, that just took way too many words. You lost a voter after the first three. So again, this goes back to what you were saying earlier, that the Republican Party likes to focus on the issue itself. And the Republican Party can say, yes, the Democratic Party has left the mainstream of America on abortion a long time ago. But in order to explain that, you need to write a dissertation. For the Democrats to make their point that Republicans are extreme, they have to write a 3-word sentence.
Yep, you're right. And frankly, that does put them at an advantage. All right, let's go to the other heartening thing that we've seen in the numbers, which John kind of mentioned earlier a little bit, which is you're seeing both Republicans and Trump making inroads with Hispanic voters. We've been talking about this on this podcast since day one. I've been screaming about it for basically a decade when I started helping out the RNHA very early on in my political career. And you just saw, even Joe Biden is admitting now that this is a problem. The Democrats are scrambling here. There was a poll last week that showed Biden's support amongst Hispanics has dropped by 12 points in the last 3 years. Trump's support has not gained. He stayed about the same as he was. But you're talking about a significant drop from Biden in the polls. And because we're running low on time, there's a few other things in here I could point out about how Biden support is dropping. And in some cases, Trump support is actually inching up a little bit. But either way, no matter how you look at these numbers, even Democrats are admitting that they're scrambling here because Hispanics are starting to leave them in significant numbers. John, because you brought it up earlier, I want to start with you and then anyone else who has thoughts on this.
Sure. I mean, again, just to reiterate, at the end of the day, all Americans, whether, whatever hyphen you want to describe them as, at the end of the day, they're all still Americans, and we're all still facing the same problems of affordability, the same problems of public safety, and all of those issues. I would only add that, while there's this implied assumption that the Latino voting bloc is tied to immigration policy and what's going on at the border and all that. I mean, frankly, I think a lot of Latino American voters are just as concerned about what's going on at the border as any other American, and frankly, they just don't like seeing the chaos down there. So it's funny because maybe Dems think that they are catering to them by keeping it open and letting anyone who wants to come in. But I would bet you anything that again, part of the reason why you're seeing Latino voters kind of gravitating in the other direction now is because they don't like that, and they actually want some semblance of security down there.
Yeah, listen, you're right. The quotes back from the Democrats on these polls were very much what you're saying, that Biden's messaging has been focused on saving democracy and focusing on social issues like abortion and migrants and immigration a little bit. And these political observers have said that for Hispanics, actually the top issue for them are day-to-day economic issues. They don't really care about saving democracy, and they're not as interested in immigration as Democrats seem to think that they are. We always seem to assume that because we're so bad on our side of the aisle, the Democrats must be great. But this is yet another indication that, frankly, Democrats are not doing a really good job here. And we're not making gains because we are doing a good job. We're making gains because they're doing so poorly. But if we could start to do a better job messaging on cost of living issues, on day-to-day economic issues, Hispanics are showing, just poll after poll and election after election, they're showing that Hispanics want an alternative, and they're just sort of begging Republicans to give them that alternative.
100%.
Well, and I think some of the messaging, like Democrats calling Hispanics like Latinx, and Jill Biden's comment about how they're like breakfast tacos, like those kind of things they're not effective. And then also you look at different parts of the country, like Miami. I mean, Ron DeSantis's reelection, I mean, he won Miami-Dade County, which is like unheard of for a Republican. We've seen some improvements, in South Texas. So I think it goes back to that point that we've kind of been making, over the course of the last couple of subjects, that like Hispanic Americans are not monolithic, and there's a lot of opportunities, in different areas of the country. One of my friends, he immigrated here from El Salvador, and they just found out that they're having twins. And he texted me last week and was so excited and said, "Hey, 2 more Republican voters on the way." So, that's what it is. You add 2 at a time. We'll get it done. 18 years from now, we'll have 2 more votes. So brace yourselves.
Yeah. And Michael, to your point, right? One thing that's interesting is that from this point, 1/3 of Latino voters that are currently going to be ready or in the electorate to vote this coming presidential election, 1/3 of them were not voters in 2016, right? So this is a dynamic population within the United States that, as Michael said, is not monolithic. I do agree with John. I think a lot of the 12-point shift towards Republicans or away from Democrats, however you want to view it, is mostly driven by economic issues. It's also been, if you drill into the polling, there was a poll released by Pew that showed almost all of those gains were among non-college educated Latinos, right? So I think what we have as Republicans to do is, it's obviously a really great thing that we're seeing these numbers. I think this is the best Republicans have been performing with Latino voters since the 2004 Bush reelection. But I personally have the view that it's more a gain of circumstance than what we're actually doing to increase our outreach. I think we have to be better as a party at going after Latino voters where they're at, and not letting circumstances just benefit us. We actually have to show up and want to earn their vote. I know, at least in my campaign, that's what I tried to do, and I did see some benefits from it in certain Latino areas of DuPage County. That's the case nationally. So that's just one point I wanted to emphasize. It will change fast. Just because we're doing well in 2024 doesn't mean we'll do well in 2026 or 2028. We got to actually want to earn people's votes if they're going to give them to us repeatedly.
Well, you see it in this data here, right? I mean, this is Biden dropping 12, and then those voters don't know where to go, which is why in some polls you see Kennedy actually getting as high as 20% amongst Hispanic voters because they don't know where to go. They're dropping off of Biden, but they're not going to Trump. And we saw it in Illinois in 2022. We saw a 6-point swing towards Republicans in districts that had significant Hispanic population, but it was because the Hispanics just stayed home. They didn't not vote Democrat and then vote Republican. They just said, we're not voting Democrat, so we're just not voting. So to your point, Greg, it shows an opening here, but yeah, we're getting some benefit just because they're not voting for the other side, but why don't we get a double benefit and actually get them to vote for us?
Exactly.
All right, let's keep moving just because we are already way ahead of time and there's a couple topics I still want to hit before we close this down. So we've got John here who's located in Chicago, Chris being close to Chicago. So let's just briefly talk about this fight between Springfield and CTU because it's been fascinating to watch. There's a bill down in Springfield that basically, to overly summarize, would stop CPS and CTU from being able to close any schools until 2027. And CTU is losing their minds over this, even though it's a bill they actually wanted like a month ago. But we've been seeing a lot of this super progressive agenda under Brandon Johnson be empowered in Chicago public schools with, removing the peace officers and wanting to close down selective enrollment schools and wanting to change the formula for how they fund the schools themselves. And here you're now seeing some pushback from Springfield Democrats against some of those moves. So just curious, Chris and John, especially since you guys are much closer to this, maybe the rest of us, what are you guys seeing here with this battle? Because it's fascinating to me to see that fight.
I'll just mention that. Yeah, it is fascinating to see that. I mean, on the one hand, obviously, Brandon Johnson's a CTU puppet that they were able to successfully get elected, so they're getting pretty much everything they want out of him. But that influence doesn't go, far beyond the mayor's office. I mean, again, just to reiterate earlier, when Johnson pushed for this real estate transfer tax hike, and the CTU were, coordinating school field trips to get eligible voters to the ballot boxes to help get that through, still didn't work. Then and when you go beyond Chicago down to Springfield, yeah, all of a sudden they're discovering the hard way that Springfield actually isn't a rubber stamp, like the mayor's office is for them right now. So I mean, I think it's encouraging, because having a puppet in one major office is enough, but having sort of at least one check against them beyond Chicago I'm really happy to see that.
A lot of this comes out of the CTU and progressives in general misunderstanding or perhaps overstating their popularity after Brandon Johnson. Brandon Johnson did not win because the voters of Chicago longed for a far left, CTU puppet to be in the mayor's office. Brandon Johnson got elected mayor because voters didn't want someone who they thought was a Republican, Paul Vallis, to be the next mayor of Chicago. That was more of the real reason why Brandon Johnson's mayor. But the CTU and the progressive allies looked at this victory and said, we got to pass this real estate transfer tax. We got to take everything we can from the Chicago public school system. We got to get the police officers out of there. We got to shut down all the charter schools and the selective enrollment schools because that's the mandate voters gave us, without understanding that the people who actually represent Chicago down in Springfield had no intention of doing anything that the CTU really wants. The CTU itself has not been popular since like the 80s. They don't have a high approval rating amongst the voters of Chicago because they go on strike every 5 minutes when they don't get what they want. And the last thing people want is to have their kids not go to school. So the CTU, again, we're dealing with arrogant progressives, most of them from wealthy families who don't know anything about the real world, going in and thinking they have a mandate for change and nobody can tell them otherwise. Well, they're about to get humbled down in Springfield right now with Croak's bill and basically say, no. You are not going to be in charge. there are still other checks on your authority, and Brandon Johnson is not the ruler of the world because he won by 4 points in 2023.
Yeah, I just love the hypocrisy of, Rom closes schools and it's the end of the world, but now they want to close some schools and it's okay. I mean, this is the same group that said they wanted a fully elected school board before they didn't want a fully elected school board. It's the same group that said they wanted, they wanted to stop these school closings. Now they want to be allowed to do the school closings. I mean, it's rank hypocrisy in politics. And as you said, Chris, I think a lot of people are seeing through it when even Democrats in Springfield are trying to stop them from what they're doing. Listen, when you're so progressive that even the Sun-Times says, woo, no, we don't support that, you've gone too far.
Yeah.
All right, we're on Chicago.
I should mention the union-owned Sun-Times on top of
right.
That. Go ahead.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. We're talking about Chicago. Let's give you Chicago guys a chance to talk about this, which is Brandon Johnson is facing the beginnings of a potential recall effort. He's not even a year into his first term. He is 11 months basically into his first term, and there's already an effort to recall him. It's a multi-step effort because they don't currently have the ability to do so, but just curious what you guys are thinking. And I'll ask for us suburban and downstate people how much of a gift Brandon Johnson is for our messaging. But I guess we'll start with Chris and John just about how unprecedented is this, and then we can talk about, does this have ramifications? And for me and Greg doing our suburban politics, Michael downstate with Madison County trying to secede from the state. I mean, the more Chicago looks inept and super progressive, the more it helps all of us electing Republicans, so we don't mind it.
Yeah, and on top of that, again, not even a year into Johnson's administration, his first chief of staff quit too. On top of that,
yep.
But as far as this recall, I mean, currently the city of Chicago doesn't have a recall mechanism to recall their mayor. There is an effort ahead now. It's going to be a steep hill to climb. They're going to need to collect a heck of a lot of signatures to be able to get it on the ballot. But again, I mean, we're not even a year into his administration, and we're already seeing people in his administration quit, and voters trying to try to install a recall mechanism into the books now. And not to mention, again, his real estate transfer tax hike was defeated. There haven't been a lot of wins for the Johnson administration thus far, and I can also tell you that I think he's risking having a lot of core constituents and supporters in his camp turning on him because they're not thrilled with the way he's handled the migrant crisis either, and where they're busing everyone, and now we're getting measles outbreaks, for God's sake, in the middle of Chicago. I mean, it has not been a great first year of his administration.
Yeah, and it's no surprise that it's even happening. And we're talking about 11 months, but in reality, you could have done this like 6 months ago, and there would have still been a mandate to recall Brandon Johnson as mayor because his mayoralship has been a disaster from the very beginning. I think if they can get this on the ballot, it'll probably pass. Again, I don't know how binding it's going to be because technically there's no authority, but we'll see what happens. My question, or my concern, is that there's a precedent for Chicago having some pretty terrible mayors lately. I mean, when we think about Lightfoot, I mean, even Rom might have been able to be recalled at some point. Daley towards the end wasn't very popular. So Richard M. Daley, of course, not the King Richard J. Daley, but my concern is that the city of Chicago is going to keep electing terrible mayor after terrible mayor because that's just how it works in Chicago. That's how the demographics work. You keep electing bad mayors, and we're just going to have to recall the guy after a year because, this guy sucked. Let's try something else. Like that's my concern. As much as I would like any other human being other than like Maureen Newman and Pat Brady to be mayor of Chicago, I also think that you're setting yourself up for bad precedent to literally have a revolving door of mayors because we haven't had a truly good Chicago mayor since the old man died. So I think it's going to be, I think this is a dangerous precedent as much as I would like to have anybody else in the mayor's office.
Interesting. As we wind down this episode, just curious, Greg, Michael, I mean, we're losing Kim Foxx as an example of the horrible progressive politics of the left. Having Brandon Johnson to take her place is kind of a gift. So I don't think it's a bad thing for us to see him continue to fail in the city of Chicago. We feel bad for city residents like John because he actually has to live there. But for the rest of us, for politics, it's actually not too bad.
Well,
I agree.
The irony is that, so goes the city. Oftentimes, Collin, so goes the suburbs too. Obviously, we have a different approach here. We as suburbanites want to see Chicago succeed because it's good for our communities as well, because there's spillover from the policies happening in Chicago. I actually have a little bit of a different take though politically. While having an example of, extreme progressive politics in Chicago is always good to point the differences on the outcomes of policy. What I do believe Brandon Johnson's becoming is someone for statewide Democrats to point to and differentiate themselves from. J.B. Pritzker, for example, has not shied away from getting into tiffs with the mayor where he has felt appropriate. And, oftentimes you look at the governor's policies, they're very progressive. But if there's someone more progressive than him, he gets to claim the moderate lane, right? So I think it's a double-edged sword that we got to consider.
That's a really good point. All right, let's close this down because I've already taken up way too much of your time. We missed 4 or 5 agenda topics. So as we close, we always give you guys a chance to give any closing thoughts. It could be on one of the topics we skipped or just something you want to talk about. But we'll close down here, give each of you a chance to give some closing thoughts. John, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. It was a great first appearance, so I appreciate it. Would love to come back. And all I can say is right now, my wife and I are taking some serious consideration into some vacation destinations right around August 19th through the 22nd. There may be something going on in Chicago that week. I don't know, but I don't think we want to be here for that.
Oof, yeah, and if the closure of I-90 or 190 going into O'Hare this week is any indication, the DNC is going to be a cluster. Sheesh. Greg, final thoughts from you.
Well, I've just really enjoyed the time. I think we covered a lot of bases. I think there's a lot of room for optimism in the Republican side in Illinois. I know that sounds ridiculous to say, but I think as we've touched on today, there's some positive trends that if we know how to successfully capitalize on them, if we stick together and not eat our own, I think we'll have a lot of success over the coming years. But really appreciate the invite, Collin, John, Michael, and Chris. Great to be with you as well, and look forward to coming back soon.
Appreciate you being here. Chris, go ahead.
So things are looking rough as always, as I tell you every week. I'm not telling you it's over, but things are looking rough. But this last weekend I had a pretty good weekend. It was a beautiful weekend. Played some golf, played some football, and that's to remind you all that there's a life out there outside of politics. We get bogged down in talking about this bill, this policy. Who cares about anything? Take care of yourself, man. All you viewers out there, take care of yourself. Take some time. Go out with the boys. Go play 18 holes, go for a walk around the forest preserve, do something. But take some time away from politics. Don't listen to this podcast, skip a week. I don't care. Don't do that. But take some time between now and July to basically stop and smell the roses, enjoy spring, and stay away from cicadas because, there's more to life than politics, man.
Yeah, well, I mean, not like we have baseball right now to watch, Chris. So I don't know what you're talking about. But
I'm intentionally not bringing up the White Sox, Collin.
Hopefully the Bears have a good draft next week. That's all I'm hoping for. All right, Michael, close this down, buddy.
All right, sounds good. I just want to say, we talked about a lot of polling and some stats and stuff. It just looks like at this moment in time, there's a lot of opportunities for us as Republicans to kind of make some inroads with groups and demographics that typically, hadn't voted for us. So just keep an eye out for those opportunities because I think, turnout's going to be low and anything can happen when turnout's low. So find votes where you can.
I like it. Well, thank you to our guests. Thank you to our watchers. As Chris said earlier, like and subscribe. Always got to say that. We actually gave Lane Davis, our producer, like 5 minutes off. So Abe Levy, Core's data wizard, is taking over for the week. So thanks to Abe, our producer for the week. And we'll catch you all next week in the smoke-filled room. Thanks all.
Thanks, guys.